Thank you, Jeffrey. It's not only our grandchild that brings me here. I mean, I believe deeply in being part of a great transmission belt. And I was the beneficiary of the transmission belt when I was in your place, and I feel it's my pleasure to keep this thing going. And at the urging of my wife, who of 40 plus years, who is the wisest member of the family, I have now changed the title of this seminar. So I'm now calling it The Rise, Demise, and Revival of the Nuclear Arms Reduction and Threat Reduction Enterprise, which we are a part of. She has scolded me more than once, not just to complain, but to, okay, what do we do about it? That piece is absolutely essential. So I'm going to wind up there, I hope. And I'm going to ask you to put your thinking caps on, because we're going to need a lot of help to get out of the hole that we are now in. But let me start by saying our community, the community some of you are about to join, others of you have been members in good standing for many years. Our community is not a large community. I would say that globally, maybe there are 1,500 of us. Less? It's not a big number. But think of what we have accomplished. Our small little brainiac community. Think about what we accomplished to allow for the rise of what's generically known as arms control. And we need a new name for it, but we used to call it arms control. Think about this. We have gone 70 plus years without a mushroom cloud on a battlefield. 70 plus years. Nobody thought that was possible when the nuclear age suddenly dawned. We have gone 50 plus years without a mushroom cloud on a test site. 50 years. That's amazing. And the combination of these two norms, no battlefield use, mushroom cloud, no testing to produce a mushroom cloud. These two norms have become the pillars of our collective practice. Now, how do we explain this amazing success story that nobody predicted? Well, some people would like to explain it in terms of deterrence. Oh yeah, deterrence. That's why we haven't had mushroom clouds on battlefields. Well, deterrence alone didn't accomplish this. Deterrence is dangerous. Deterrence is all about threat. Deterrence is all about the threat that leaves something to chance. And deterrence leaves quite a bit to chance. as we have discovered, as we get deeper and deeper into these very intense near mushroom cloud situations during the Cold War. So don't buy that. It wasn't deterrence alone. Deterrence was a part of it. But it was the complementary part of it that really yielded positive gains. And that complementary part is called diplomacy. Nuclear diplomacy, threat reduction diplomacy, arms control diplomacy, arms reduction diplomacy, crisis management diplomacy, cooperative threat reduction diplomacy. Deterrence alone doesn't offer gains. Deterrence is about trying to prevent really, really bad things from happening by threatening really, really bad things. You don't get gains from that. The very best you can do is to manage to get by. We've done a lot better than that, managing to get by. And the reasons why we have done a lot better than that is this thing that has generically been called arms control, which is about diplomacy that complements deterrence. Now think about how hard it was for the folks at the very front end of this process, whose legacy you are about to bequeath. Think about how hard this was. None of this would have happened without the acceptance of vulnerability. And can you imagine how hard it was to accept vulnerability after Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Mutual assured destruction. Can you imagine if you're in the advertising business trying to sell that? My God, that was hard. And yet, people did it. Very smart people did it. Very committed people did it. Very committed people understood that we cannot get a hold on this nuclear arms competition unless somehow we can accept vulnerability. There were consequences to that. And part of the unraveling piece that we're going to get to relates to our forgetting of this basic lesson of how you gain purchase to reduce nuclear dangers. Paradoxically, by accepting nuclear danger, at least in some forms, not in others. How else did we get here? If it was just deterrence, if this were just about deterrence, there'd be mushroom clouds with nuclear testing still, even to this day. Why? Well, we gotta fine-tune our deterrence. How do we fine-tune new warhead designs? Well, you don't do that just in the laboratory, you test them out. How do you test them out? Well, the old wisdom was you test them at design yields, or at least half of a whopping design yield. That's a mushroom cloud. Can't do that underground. People worked very hard to stop mushroom clouds. in the form of nuclear tests. Public movements joining up with thoughtful members of Congress and distinguished physicists and think tanks and advocacy groups, and it took a lot of work. And it took a huge scare, the Cuban Missile Crisis, to accept this, if you will, downsizing of deterrence. This was in 1963. A building block to limitations on the underground yields of nuclear tests, to a comprehensive test ban treaty, which was negotiated 3 decades later, still hasn't entered into force. How did we survive this craziness of the Cold War? Remember, think of how you feel about Kim Jong-un with nuclear weapons in his possession. That's a pretty scary thought. Now think about 2 megalomaniacs leading major powers, masters of millions of deaths within their own countries. 2 guys that make Kim Jong-un look like a high schooler when it comes to nuclear threat. I am referring, of course, to Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. And when these guys first got their hands on nuclear weapons, think about how unsettling that was. We're talking about major powers led by mass murderers who obtained the bomb. And we managed to get through that. How did we manage to do this? Well, part of the diplomacy of this precarious time was to accept tacitly zones of influence, to accept tacitly not to play with fire in the other guy's most sensitive backyards. And for the United States, it also meant agreeing not to arm our newfound allies in Europe and Asia with nuclear weapons. The guys we fought against in World War II. And we were so disturbed by these 2 megalos that had got themselves nuclear weapons, threatened to use them. We will bury you. We were so concerned, we thought about arming Germany, West Germany at the time, and Japan with nuclear weapons. We decided not to do that. And when we decided not to do that, there came an opening to negotiate the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. An amazing accomplishment. Amazing accomplishment. It started out pretty modest, but it kept, as you have studied, getting more encompassing, and regime building pieces started to fit into place. What an extraordinary achievement. Also, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a treaty, the only one trying to regulate behavior in outer space. Hasn't been duplicated since, just as the NPT hasn't been duplicated since. So then we come to the first superpower accords governing offensive and defensive strategic forces. We're now up to the early 1970s. Somehow we've survived two-plus decades of harrowing experience. And lo and behold, amazingly, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to strict limitations on national missile defenses, the acceptance of vulnerability. Think about how hard a sell that was. It was a hard sell to the Soviet leadership. What do you mean we don't defend the motherland? It was a hard sell to the United States people. But the case was made and the case was persuasive. And reluctantly, the Nixon administration accepted this deep constraint on national missile defenses and very porous constraints on offensive systems. Fast forward to the most amazing 13-year period in the history of superpower arms control. It begins with Ronald Reagan and his partner Mikhail Gorbachev. This is the luckiest pairing in the history of nuclear danger. Two guys, unorthodox thinkers, out of the box. They were not enthralled with nuclear weapons. And they aimed for the moon. And they fell to Earth, but in the meantime, they accomplished a complete elimination, bans on several categories of ground-based missiles. On-site inspections. The floodgates were open. Conditions were right. The Soviet Union was in dire straits. And so, in this apogee, this 13-year period, that included the tail end of the Reagan administration, the George W. Bush administration, and Bill Clinton's presidency. And we've got not just this INF treaty, we have two treaties reducing strategic offensive arms. Finally, all the loopholes of that very first Nixon-era agreement had been shut tight. And 85% reductions in strategic forces. Deep cuts in conventional forces, a treaty governing them, and inspections and confidence building measures for Europe. Open Skies Treaty. Nobody talks about it. It's important. We can talk about it in Q&A if you want. Finally, at long last, a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty is negotiated. A chemical weapons convention is negotiated. And most creative of all, non-Lugar cooperative threat reduction programs. A failed state with thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles no longer within its control. Not one of them resulted in a mushroom cloud. Amazing, creative work. This was the rise of our collective business, the demise. This is where we are now. There's what I call a great unraveling happening now, where these amazing accomplishments are being rolled back or under threat. The nuclear order is shaky. All of its major stanchions are in need of reinforcement. The NPT, as you know, is under stress. Strategic arms reductions have slowed to a trickle. And the United States and Russia are replacing submarines, bombers, missiles with newer varieties. One of the accomplishments of that rise period was the banning of multiple warheads atop land-based missiles. Well, that stuff is showing up again. Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is in limbo because of a very onerous entry into force provision. Russia has pulled out of conventional arms reductions. Confidence building, it's playing games with the Open Skies Treaty. Some of these treaties have been jettisoned completely, others are in bad shape. The geopolitical order is wobbly. It's not just the United States and Russia, where we have real friction. It's also the United States and China. This is now a three-party big boy game. So much easier when it's just two. And both of those dyads, man, there's a lot of friction, and there can be more. So we are at a dangerous juncture. China is building up its nuclear forces, maybe picking up the pace. Certainly Pakistan and India are picking up the pace. North Korea is the wild card. We're not sure if the Iran deal will hold. And prospects for new treaties look dim. How did this happen? How did the great unraveling happen? To me, the most important aspect of the unraveling is that the United States overreached. When we won the Cold War, after we won the Cold War, we decided to expand NATO. And this started under the Bill Clinton administration. And at first, it was just a small thing, just a few countries in the heart of Europe, old Europe, that somehow got caught behind the anchor. And when this momentous decision was made, not a single member of the cabinet in the Clinton administration opposed it. How's that for hubris? One member of the cabinet, the Secretary of Defense, voiced misgivings. And he didn't say, don't do it. He said, hey, let's wait a couple of years. The Secretary of State was mute during the cabinet meeting where this was decided. Can you imagine? A decision of this geopolitical import Warren Christopher said nothing. The Pentagon said nothing. Even though the expansion of NATO committed the United States of America to the defense of these countries, which did not themselves have really great defense capabilities. And we were moving the boundaries of NATO toward Russia. Our Cold War fear was that Russia would move the boundaries westward. No. Now we're moving toward Russia. And having agreed to expand NATO modestly, then it was quite obvious what the dialectics of this were. Every other former country of the Warsaw Pact and some former states of the Soviet Union would want to join. And the George W. Bush administration, elected by one vote on the US Supreme Court, decided we would promote democracy. And we wouldn't just promote it in Afghanistan or Iraq. We were going to promote it all across Europe to include states along much closer to the Russian border, including 3 states with a combined standing army of 26,000 troops of the former Soviet Union. I'm referring, of course, to the Baltic states, which we are now obligated to defend. And the Bush administration wanted to include Ukraine and Georgia as well. And lo and behold, Vladimir Putin has been pushing back hard. Once Russia got off of its back and back on its feet, the pushback has been severe. Most obvious in Ukraine and Georgia, which will no longer be joining NATO, because they have Russian forces on their territory. And we have Putin disregarding the sovereign borders of his neighbors. We have Putin actively engaged in messing up the democratic process of countries in Europe and the United States of America. As bad as the Cold War was, and believe me, it was bad, these 2 aspects were missing. It's not just Russia. China is feeling its oats. A successful economy, moving more and more resources into the military budgets, trying to protect and, trying to establish a zone of influence around its periphery. And by the way, we have allies around its periphery. We are transitioning from the unipolar to the multipolar, and it's messy. It's hard to stabilize. The non-nuclear weapon states, especially the so-called non-aligned movement, are no longer strong supporters of the NPT, as is evidenced by the ban treaty negotiations that have begun. The center does not seem to be holding the way it did when we accomplished the most amazing things. The center had to hold. The Republican Party no longer backs nuclear diplomacy, which, as I previously asserted, has been essential to the great accomplishments of the post-Cold War era. And if you don't believe in diplomacy, what have you got? I mean, what are your other options? You can either watch from the sidelines as nuclear dangers grow, or you can muscle up and put U.S. forces in harm's way again. So that's where we are. Okay, how do we gather ourselves? How do we act to try to revive the amazing things that were accomplished? First, it seems to me, we have to play damage limitation. There has been great unraveling, but there is still much to lose, and we have to try to protect as many of the gains as we can. What does this mean? It means trying to protect the two essential norms from which all other good things can happen. And these norms relate to diminishing the value of nuclear weapons. And there's still plenty of them out there. We diminish the value of nuclear weapons every day that a mushroom cloud does not appear on the battlefield. Because every day that doesn't happen, and how many days has it been? Somebody who's a wizard at math worked from December 9th, 1945 to the present day.
August 9th. August 9th.
August 9th, I'm sorry. August 9th, 1945 to March the 30th, 2017. I have no idea.
26,167.
I love you. Thank you. 26,000 success stories. We have to protect against the resumption of nuclear testing, because every nuclear test is a declaration of utility, a declaration of importance, a declaration of threat. Now, it's true that there's still a country out there that tests, but there could be 9 of these countries out there that test. And we may come to that if we lose this threshold. I'm not going to ask you how many days it's been since the Limited Test Ban Treaty entered into force, but it's a lot. Every one of those days has been a success story. We have to do everything in our power to hold on to these barriers. We have to remember the keys to success, and we have to reteach them to our fellow citizens, because they've been widely forgotten. So I've mentioned 2 hugely important keys to success, and I bet you can think of others. But one key to success is deterrence is dangerous, and it needs to be accompanied by diplomacy. We have forgotten this lesson so much that when the Obama administration tried diplomacy with Iran, I mean, it was like all hell broke loose. And not a single Republican member of Congress supported an agreement that, if properly implemented, would prevent Iran from getting a weapon for the next 15 years. That's not good enough. Well, how do you do better? Do you bomb? Is that how you do better? It may come to that. I don't think we will do better by bombing. And now, with the North Korea problem front and center, how do we gain purchase on that if we don't engage in diplomacy? But we have not had sustained diplomacy in dealing with this problem from one administration to the next since the tail end of the Carter administration. In my judgment, you may differ with that. You don't? You okay with that assertion? The Clinton administration gave it a shot belatedly, and they made some progress, and the Bush administration comes in and we walk away. How dare you try to get the bomb through a second means? We're not going to negotiate with you. We're not going to stop it the way the plutonium route was stopped. We will sanction you, and we will put a scarlet letter A on your military tunics. That's a lesson we have to reteach our fellow citizens. The second important lesson I talked about, there is no defense against this threat. And the more we pile on missile defense system after missile defense system, the more likely it is that the penetration requirements on the other side are going to grow. These are hugely important keys to success. And we can't take them for granted. Our fellow citizens have forgotten them. We have to do some creative thinking. That's where you come in. Because some of us aren't creative enough anymore. We used as the basic unit of account for arms reduction between the United States and the Soviet Union / Russia as strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, right? So a submarine, a missile that can fly over an ocean, and a bomber. And we undercounted. We gave ourselves wiggle room. But this unit of account, we have to ask ourselves, does it still work for us? Is it still the effective account? Is there another account we can use? I'm going to get back to this. We have thought through arms reduction between two countries. One of the two has said, you got to bring in the rest, or at least you got to bring in somebody else. Particularly the Chinese, because the Russians aren't so comfortable with where China is heading. Can we design a new system, as hard as it is going to be, that deals with other nuclear armed states? Nobody gets a pass. Can we design a system like this? Everybody has to contribute something to make the world a safer place, to reduce nuclear dangers. We haven't thought enough about that. I'd like you to think about it. I'd like you to think about how we can reinforce the non-proliferation treaty, because it's in trouble. It's in trouble. And the two blocks that used to be very supportive, one, the nuclear armed states, sorry, it doesn't work anymore. You're not doing enough to invest in this regime. You're taking it for granted. And the mature, for lack of a better word, non-aligned states that used to be front and center in support of this treaty. They're not anymore. Who's leading the charge for a ban treaty? If I'm not mistaken, it's the government of Austria, lo and behold. And Egypt, and New Zealand, and on and on and on. This treaty is lacking in supporters, and we need to find ways to change that. And a ban treaty with a date certain attached to it, you've got to get rid of these weapons by 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And then what? How does the energy that is going into, the vitality that's going into the ban treaty? And I applaud that. I love it. I love that there's new energy. But what happens to that energy if after 10, 15, or 20 years, lo and behold, nuclear weapons are still with us in great number? Does that vitality turn into despondency? Does it turn into anger? Does it lead to further damage to the NPT? We need to think through that. Is there a way for us to channel this energy into support for the NPT rather than energy that undermines it? That's for you folks to work on. Don't sit on the sidelines on this one. It's important. We have to recreate a consensus in our own country about the value of nuclear diplomacy, threat reduction. You would think we wouldn't need to after we used force of arms in Iraq, after we succeeded in greatly delaying an Iranian nuclear program. But we do need to. People don't get it. We need to sit down with our fellow citizens. And we need to rethink this unit of account. We need to think of units of account that clarify success rather than defeat. If you set a unit of account of a ban treaty within 10 years, you are guaranteeing defeat. Why set a construct that guarantees defeat? Is there a way we can turn this into victory? Day by day, one day at a time victories. That's meaningful. It's not enough, but it's meaningful. I have a hunch we're going to need to turn to a new unit of account, which is the warhead. The warhead. It's the warhead. It's not the delivery vehicle, it's the warhead. But that's a tough unit of account. It means we need monitoring of refurbishments. We need monitoring of dismantlement everywhere. Hard problems, but they are soluble problems. And we put them off because they were harder than this strategic nuclear delivery vehicle thing. That was easy to see and inspect, but I think we're going to have to go there. And by the way, if we go there, there are success stories there as well. Because every year, a country like the United States, and not only the United States, dismantles dozens and dozens and dozens of these warheads. We have long queues of dismantlement. That can be a success story. All right, I have just bloviated now for a long time. So let's open this up. And what do you think?
I like how you did that to them right after you told them they were going to have to figure out how to solve this really hard. Thank you. Now, what do you think?